So I actually I really like the idea. So bringing in a newcomer is one of the classic ways. Another you hear a lot about is like, as you know, Bob, where that one's not as highly regarded because it's a bit of an info dump. But one thing that I noticed, a lot of these worlds tend to use some of the same character archetypes, I would say. You know, vampires appear in many of these worlds, werewolves appear in many of these worlds, and you also get some more customized creepies. How do you think about, you know, when you're looking to see who to populate your worlds with? And I'll throw this one first to you, Charlaine, just because you've written a world that was featured the vampires very prominently. You know, how do you think of using, you know, the pros and the cons, and, you know, what's easier or what's harder if you're using an established type of creepy?
Well, I start off with one kernel of an idea. In this case, it was a barmaid who couldn't date regular people. And from that tiny little bit of an idea, everything just sort of gathered around that. The fact that she couldn't read vampire minds, so she could date vampires. I had no idea vampires were going to be in it until it started expanding and grew to the state it eventually got to, which was enormous, with a cast of, honestly, it felt like thousands of characters. But that, it just grew from the germ of an idea, so it all had to work to make her who she was. And that was the beginning of the idea, and then the world evolved to make her the person she had to be to tell the story I wanted to tell. That seems very convoluted, but that's the way my starts of books work.
Then it sounds convoluted, but it also makes sense. And Patricia, I see. I was going to go to you next anyway and ask the same question, but you can just take it.
Well, one of the things about using archetypal type monsters like vampires and werewolves and ghosts and witches and things is that as a writer, they work as a shortcut. We don't want to bore our readers by giving them long, involved descriptions of creatures that are not. And the more of those that you do in a book, the harder they are. If you have one, that's fine, but it's like Cthulhu. You have one description and then you carry it through a series of books until everybody knows what Cthulhu is. But other than that, you know, a movie can show you a different creature. But books, we have to work with what people already know. So vampires and werewolves and ghosts and dragons and all of that, you know, and fantasy dragons and the typical monsters that we use, then as a writer, all we have to do is tell you how our creatures differ from what you think of when you hear that power word. So I say dragon, every person here, every person out there hears the word dragon, and you have a picture in your head what a dragon looks like. And then all I have to do is say, well, my dragon is a Chinese dragon, you're right? And it's, and I can give you cues that give you a big picture in your head with relatively few words, and it doesn't drag the story down. Description always drags the story down. So by using these archetypal characters, then we can make the story run. Urban fantasy, as it exists now, because urban fantasy existed before our current iteration of urban fantasy, and it was quite a bit different. So, you know, Tim Powers' urban fantasy is a lot different from what we consider an urban fantasy now. And what it was driven by sales. When they asked me to write an urban fantasy, they said that they had experimented with other kinds of creatures. There was a really good romance series that dealt with goblins, for instance, and I cannot remember the author or the books right now, but anyway. But
anyone in the chat finds it, let us know.
Okay. And they were really awesome, but they didn't pull the readers in as vampires and werewolves did. So when they asked me to write urban fantasy, they said, okay, this book has to deal with vampires and or werewolves and involve a heroine. The main character needs to be female with a complicated love life involving werewolves and vampires. She doesn't herself have to be a werewolf or vampire. And that's what the sales department at Penguin, which for the first, maybe decade of urban fantasy as it exists now, Penguin dominated that era. They had Penguin Rock combination. They had Laurel K. Hamilton and Charlaine and Jim Butcher and me, and briefly they had Kelly Armstrong, and now they have her back again as they combined. But they had determined what it was that readers wanted to read. And a lot of it has to do with most of the readers that pulled into urban fantasy. Well, a lot of the readers that pulled into urban fantasy weren't fantasy readers. They were romance readers. And they were just exploring a little bit. And by giving them archetypal characters that they already knew, werewolves and vampires and things like that, we made them feel at home in a way that if they had opened Tolkien, they wouldn't have.
Gadi and I actually talk a lot about resonance. He likes the word resonance, where seeing, things that create patterns for people, make them, give them this feeling of home. And so, the idea of, feeling at home because of, frankly, alarming elements, if you encountered them in real life, were present is very real in this genre, I think.